Charlie?
I hear voices.
Charlie, keep on hiding from me.
Yeah, you are.
All right, Charlie. Well, no, man, I can see
Yeah,
you.
that's of course.
En Foco, you, the founders, you know, you have a program.
Oh, look at that. Early shows.
Yeah, dinner parties. And
Yeah.
festivals, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And we Liz, and then Roger, you, and Phil, each had a thing here. And this is, I mean, it was taken right out of the, right? I mean, you feel mafia done, you know? You follow Marlon Brando.
Long.
Oh, nice copy of the original. Yeah, that came from. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Aguado, and I am the Executive Director of En Foco. And we are here at the Dorsky Museum, SUNY Newport, celebrating En Foco's Dos Mundos Narratives exhibition. My guest today is the very special Charles Biasiny-Rivera, more affectionately known as Charlie, who is the founder and executive director of En Foco for a number of years, from the mid-70s on. I have known Charlie since the mid-70s, and I worked closely with him from the 80s on, and we have remained friends. Charlie is quite an accomplished artist, and I think that's where we will begin. This is not going to be a standard interview, you know. It's what always struck me, and it was very influential to me, is that En Foco was a collective for artists, and your commitment was to artists. And perhaps you can tell us what the time was like back then in the mid-70s when Phil, Dante, Roger Caban, and several others, and you came together to form En Foco. What was the environment like? What were you hoping for?
Well, it was pretty sparse as far as recognition was concerned. We were all disappointed by the critics who seemed to totally pass over photographers that were coming out of the communities, especially the Spanish-speaking communities. And since we're all Puerto Ricans, we were very interested in bringing the artists, the photographic artists that we knew, into a larger audience. That had not been so on any major scale.
Yeah, but it was also a larger issue of the recognition of photography as an art form and photographers as artists. So you were pushing hard to get that general recognition, not just for the Puerto Rican community, but for the lens itself.
Yeah. One of the categories or levels of acceptance was a high degree of photographic art, or how the photographers were using their cameras to describe their world. Now, their world, the Puerto Rican photographers, was practically invisible. So what we did is to open the curtains much wider and present a number of photographic artists who had never been shown before and whose work really deserved exposure to a much larger audience.
Prior to En Foco coming together, a lot of the original members was part of the original exhibit called Dos Mundos, that was curated by Gino Rodriguez. You want to just, because that was instrumental in artists coalescing together. So you tell me a little bit about the original Dos Mundos?
Well, that was a very important show. It was the first large presentation of Puerto Rican photographers on a major scale and on a platform that presented them as accomplished artists, and also brought clarity to the degree of importance within photography that their work showed. Now, we were all invisible, editors and other people who present the work to the larger audience didn't know about us at all. They were totally removed from our part of the of photographers. And that was our major point, is to give clarity and presentation to the work that was coming out of our community by ourselves.
You know, Charlie, you were not just a photographer who picked up a camera. You had a history prior to Dos Mundos. You worked with Cecil Beaton for a number of years as his assistant when he was in New York. You want to share that experience as well?
Yeah, that was a great opportunity to meet a worldwide presence like Cecil Beaton, and I knew about his work, but getting to meet him and to work with him was an incredible experience. It not only he not only made himself visible to ourselves, but he cared about how much we were involved with it. As a fellow photographer, he was surprised by the level of work that was coming from our community by a number of our photographers. And that really helped when he would speak about it. He had some information about it.
And then was he involved with any of the other photographers? And
No, he was, worldwide famous photographer with a huge history of photography, doing work when all photographers were partially chemists in order to process their photographs. So he was self-taught, and like many of us, there were no universities or educational programs that included us or recognized us or knew about us. So he was a great individual who recognized the value of the work that we were doing.
now, let me ask you, because that helped shape you as an artist, and it helped shape En Foco, the purpose of En Foco. And how would you just think about what it was like sitting down with Roger Caban, Phil Dante, and you? How does En Foco come out of this?
We didn't have any example of ourselves, or that is to say, individuals coming out of the Puerto Rican community present. There was no visibility. We had photographers from different cultures who, some of them were very good, who came into the community and photographed within the community, but none of them were Puerto Ricans. Our interest was the development of the artists who were using photography as an expression of who they were and where they came from and how they came up through their lives. That was just unknown, totally unknown. No one had investigated, except for some sociologists that wrote some really dismal books about our community.
Well, I recall Bruce Davison's book, Across 106th Street or Across 103rd Street, and Phil Dante was very much angry about it and he wrote a review in the New York Times about it, and it was that type of energy. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about that, about Phil Dante.
Well, that was my first meeting with a fellow Puerto Rican who was involved in photography on a higher level. I read that article in the newspaper, and I was fascinated that there was someone else, fellow Puerto Rican, that has some knowledge and background in photography. He was a photographer himself and worked with some very important photographers, as I did with as assistants. And it was. These were rare individuals who had the opportunity to work with developed artists to help pursue their interests in a way that was true to their culture. That's a key sort of thing in photography when you send out a photographer to examine someone else's culture that doesn't belong to that culture. It always has to be translated. Usually it doesn't get translated, but it does become well known as an example of lower societies. And we were somewhat distraught that that's the way we would be conceived and described.
Well, that became the mission of En Foco, to be able to articulate your community, to expand the perception, and be able to add an element of, from a purely anthropological point of view, from the Puerto Rican perspective, of the integrity and richness of the culture.
Yeah, staying true to that made it rare. We were Puerto Ricans, and we were talking about ourselves and our family and our relatives. So we came up from an island culture that had moved into New York City and developed neighborhoods. I grew up in one. It was called El Barrio, which is just a description of a neighborhood. It was the only Puerto Rican area in New York City that you could. My father used to take me on walks there. First of all, that's where I grew up, and later on, as a pre-teenager, my father used to take me along walks through El Barrio, which is centered by around 116th Street and Lexington Avenue, a large neighborhood of Puerto Ricans. And I I got a sense of who we were, a much larger sense of who we were, by the music that's everybody seemed to be listening to coming out of the windows, and the store owners and the foods that were being presented, which were the usual foods that are found in Puerto Rico. It was a wonderful way of learning about who you were as a Puerto Rican. Up until then, I was simply a kid on the block. The block was made up with multi-ethnics up in the Bronx where I lived. And so I didn't have any example of the Puerto Rican community except on Sundays when our families, our relatives all would get together and have a party, a Sunday party. And they were dancing and singing, and when I finally got to the island of Puerto Rico, it was like revisiting my childhood again.
Yeah, yeah.
How they spoke, how they presented themselves. It was a wonderful warmth to the relationships, and the language flowed so beautifully. And the whole thing was always friendly, whereas where I was brought up, they didn't speak loudly in Spanish because it was looked down upon by the other cultures that surrounded you, primarily the English-speaking cultures. So for me, it was always a family sense being Puerto Rican, and that's what made us singular.
I noticed in this exhibit of this material and the founding of En Foco, and you have these two pictures of you going into block parties, community events, and putting up an exhibit of your works or works of other artists. Tell us a little about that experience.
Yeah, that was really important for us because we didn't have an example of this in our background. So I was interested in showing the activity within the culture here in New York City, the Puerto Rican culture in New York City, as part of that culture. So first of all, when we started beating the bush and trying to find fellow photographers, at first it was very limited. And somebody would mention, oh yeah, they take pictures. All three of us, Roger Caban and Phil Dante and myself, had been doing work professionally for a number of years. We had been printed in magazines. Our work had been printed in magazines. So we had a fair idea of how the machinery worked. And so we wanted to institute that within the community itself. So that's why we started with block parties. That was a great pouring out of people showing up to enjoy themselves. And I remember creating an exhibition installation. I was living upstate, and so it was the type of thing that it was portable. It was made out of wood, and I strapped it to the roof of the car and drove into Manhattan and disassembled it and reassembled it in all the block parties we went to. And with a couple of apple boxes or whatever it is we could find, we made seats and a tabletop and put out mimeograph. In those days, the mimeograph was the way you reproduced everything quickly. The information of what we were doing and who we were and why we were doing it. So we had a little table, an information table. We had a portable exhibition space that we quickly assembled on the spot, and it was a big success. I mean, the people just came around, and it was like they were seeing their relatives. Everyone responded to it because, wow, you never saw an exhibition that seemed to come into the neighborhood that was of yourself or your family. So that really attracted a lot of other photographers from the neighborhoods, and we started to identify them, and then we would put them into shows. And we were all doing this with, $5 out of our back pocket. And none of us were experienced in financing and how to find help in presenting this, come up with the money.
How did En Foco survive as an organization? How did you raise money? What was it?
Well, we asked other organizations, the black culture organizations, and they were fully open to helping us, and they pointed out that there were monies to be had from the government, the local government, the city, and the borough and the state. None of us had. We always, asked the photographers for a few bucks to help for the equipment and that we needed for exhibition purposes. There was no money to be had, but everybody chipped in. So we found out that you could actually present yourself to the New York City government, and they had institute set up to help you, which was amazing to us. And we began to get the necessary credentials for that, which is a learning process, how to survive without having any funds. And we learned funding.
You received funds from New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts,
Right.
National Endowment for the Arts,
Right.
and some of the banks in Con Edison, and a very special organization called the Bronx Council on the Arts.
They were especially helpful to us because somehow some of our photographers were familiar with that organization in the Bronx, especially the director of that organization, who, strangely enough, was Puerto Rican. I'm talking about Bill Aguado. And they were extremely helpful in helping us to find different organizations that were interested in what we were doing. And so that's how we developed the portable gallery, a gallery that would go to a community and just set itself up overnight with an information table and handouts of what we did and photographs, etc. And that was a big hit.
So tell me about Nueva Luz. How did that come about in the evolution of En Foco? Why a magazine?
Well, we were doing it community by community. That is to say, we were introducing ourselves and the photographers to other communities within the Bronx. And in doing so, we said, well, is there a better way of doing this? Or is there a way of improving this? And that's when we got together and decided that we could do even a better job of informing people, not just in the Bronx, but in different parts of New York City. And we went to the city and asked for their help, and they were very helpful in getting us some support of that.
And that was Greg Millard.
Yes, that's right.
I have correspondence between you and Greg about Nueva Luz.
Yes, Greg was a huge help. He was with the Cultural Council.
Department of Cultural
Yeah,
Affairs.
right. Which was an established organization. So they knew the mechanism and also the funding mechanism. We knew none of this. We expected to be paying $5 out of our back pocket for life. But it turned out that somebody was offering $10. So we began to become pretty good experts at funding and how that mechanism worked, and we contacted a number of agencies. The Bronx Council was one of the ones that really helped us out a lot.
You know, one of the things about the Bronx at the time was that there was very few organizations that had a commitment, had an understanding of what fine art was a commitment, and not just a commitment to artists, because I think that was what was one of the critical components of En Foco. I remember you telling me, in fact screaming at me, is pay the artists. And don't ask for anything in return, support the artists. And to me, that helped establish a lot of the grants programs I did for artists with, you know, fellowships, no strings attached. Invest money in the artists. And, you know, in that respect, En Foco was one of the most important organizations in our community and in New York City and in the region.
Well, yes, and we responded to that very much because it wasn't heard by anyone before, and trying to get the support of people who were in the business of handing out grants, get their attention. It was a whole new field of interest called fundraising.
Yeah, over in that vitrine, you have the first issue of Nueva Luz.
Ah, yes.
And it was designed by a good friend of yours and mine, Frank Empire.
An exceptional artist who happens to be an exceptional photographer also. But he was a bona fide graphic artist, capable of designing a magazine and understanding what's necessary. We didn't have that information within our own units, our own groups. So his expertise really brought a level of professionalism. If we were going to publish work, we wanted to be sure that work was substantial in its degree of artistry, and he was very helpful in that area, and we never broke that connection. He always designed our magazine for us, and then the catalogs for the shows he would design for us. He had great skills as a graphic artist.
What people don't understand is that he had to cut and paste every page of Nueva Luz and put the print down. So it wasn't like today you go to a computer and press a few buttons and the page is done. I mean, Frank had incredible patience to spend that time.
Yes, Frank he's a great photographer, actually. We exhibited his work. And also, as a graphic artist, he's quite developed. And he's teaching at a university in New York City.
At John Jay.
At John Jay College. Um, and he has developed his work and presented his work, and his work has been very well received. It's great to see, one of the fellows that we started off with to develop his artistry, and he teaches in the universities now.
How were the orders selected to be presented in Nueva Luz?
Well, we had an initial presentation, publicity sent out with news releases, including artistry, including graphic arts, that went out to all over New York City. And a lot of photographers responded to that. That made a big difference because we have been working with a small selection of photographers. Luckily, that selection was a pretty solid selection. They were all good, solid photographers who knew what they were doing.
Well, the first issue, you had Sophie Rivera, Tony Mendoza, and Izzy Kendall.
Right.
And how did, I mean, I know Sophie and I know Tony, but how did this come to you, your attention? Do you recall?
Right. Well, Kendrew work I saw. I was a juror on a panel that worked a funding panel that the city had developed, and I saw his work submitted in a competition, and I noted it was really fine photography, and so I approached him and saw a larger example of what he was doing. I thought that was really, really fine. And that's the first time we started to think of our community as being even larger than just the Puerto Rican activity within that community. It started to come to us that other cultures who were what they call minority cultures had some fine and developed artists. And we saw Kendrow's work in a submission, and his work was extraordinary. So we asked him if he'd like to show a portfolio of his work in our publication.
All of the artists in this exhibit, those Mundos reconstructing narratives, will be in the upcoming Nueva Luz, which is issue number 70. And it's essentially the catalog for this issue. And what En Foco, and what everyone has told me over the years, especially in the last few years, is that Nueva Luz became the exhibition opportunity for artists that there was always a record of. And we now have digitized every issue of Nueva Luz. You can go to En Foco's website and you can find every issue. And to me, that was the most important thing, is that we're able to save the legacy, the history, the work that you created still rests in that anyone can have access to it at no cost. And we're creating archives now so that our history is not forgotten. Our history is no longer an asterisk, no longer a footnote. It's there to be seen. It's there to be found. We won't get lost in the stacks. We're about almost at the end of our time. What do you think of this exhibition here?
I think this is an excellent presentation of fine photography. These individual photographers are really doing good work, presenting how they feel and how they see, which is a rarity that you can have artists like this come to you. I mean, you just don't find them. The major museums don't know of these artists, nor are they particularly interested in discovering them. It has to be an accident that brings them to their attention. So it's what En Foco was doing and trying to do with very limited resources, funding resources, for a number of years. And this is an excellent example of continuing that effort.
Well, they're part of your legacy, and these artists are your children. The children that Roger, Phil, and you, and let's not forget a very important person that helped En Foco for such a long time, Betty Biasiny, your wife, who was, we all know that as executive directors, we don't have the wives behind us. There is no organization.
That's true to the core. Absolutely. She has saved the day many a time. A very fine artist in her own right, and who can write about photography and the culture, and present her thoughts, and well-educated in the aspect of cultural development, and a good cook.
Charlie, any closing words?
Yes, I'm thrilled that my old friend Bill here has been able to put this presentation together, and hope that it'll reach the ears and the eyes of other photographers who feel that no one is ever listening to them or seeing their works.
Thank you. Charles Biasiny-Rivera, Charlie, my dear friend for so many years. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Yes, this is for Bill. One of the things I wanted to show you is the first attempt that I had as a black and white photographer to go beyond what I was doing in black and white.
Oh, wow. Can you take a picture? Can you include this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's, this is one, oh man, this is, he knows how good, he knows my English. Oh man, this is cool. Pointing my mother, all the money she spent sending me to schools. Oh! And our sister, I saved the best for last. Susanna, my buddy, the mentor to all of us, and a friend to the artist.
So wonderful. Oh, Pete.
And as a special, Charlie and I are going to have a duel with our canes.
Yes, we're having cane duels.
Most relevant medium of all. I hate to say that in front of painters. And I don't. But there's something still instant. It's instant relevance if you click that shutter. And it's different than choosing a color.
It is that moment that's so personal and it will never be repeated again. It's that level of intimacy, you're absolutely right.